This is Commander Shepard. You're listening to ThisWeekInGeek.net, and this is my favorite podcast on the Citadel.
And now it's time for another special feature.
Pickle.
Hey guys, what's going on? You are listening to ThisWeekInGeek.net. I'm your host, Mike the Birdman Dodd, and of course it is time to enjoy quarantine, and maybe you're sitting down having a quarantini right now, and that means it's time to enjoy yet another podcast for your ears. And as you may notice over the last couple of weeks, I've been talking with some pretty cool people in the RPG industry. I've talked about Mage, I've talked about Star Trek, I've talked about all sorts of other cool things, and I wanted to talk to a person I've been friends with for quite some time over the interweebs, as it may be. And I'm talking about the co-owner and general manager of Green Ronin Publishing. Her name is Nicole Lindroos, and she has been involved in the RPG industry since, I think, the late 80s, early 90s. She's done things with White Wolf Publishing. She's done a bunch of other freelance work. Her most recent stuff includes the Dragon Age RPG, The Expanse, Blue Rose, and Mutants and Masterminds, all sorts of really cool stuff in there. And I never had a chance to talk with someone more on the business side of things, because I've talked with a lot of creative types, and while Nicole does have those chops as well, there's a lot about the RPG industry I just don't know, because frankly, me and numbers don't mix, because frankly, Mike's stupid, math dumb, and I'm a performer, and that's how it goes. So, as you can hear her squealing in the background, I'd like to welcome Nicole to This Week in Geek.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, I gotta say, this has been a long time coming, because I interviewed your husband, Chris Pramis, years ago, and it has been just one of the opportunities. We've always been trying to get this to happen, but our schedules have never quite lined up, and all it took was a global pandemic to make it happen.
Funny, my schedule freed up under quarantine.
So, yeah, it's been just one of these things I've been really looking forward to. I mean, I've been a big fan of you personally for many years, because following your Facebook either is tremendously inspiring from a social justice point of view, or it's a dumpster fire of watching terrible people burn. And
yeah.
It's just been one of those things that I think it's about time we have the conversation that everybody wants to know is, what is your story? Because I've always been curious to know what it was like getting involved in a predominantly male-dominated industry early on, and now that things have opened up so wide, there's so many women creatives out there. I want your story to be told, and just, you've got quite the story to tell yourself, starting out with very big companies early on, and now running one of the most fairly successful RPG companies right now. You've been running it for something, like 20 years now?
It is our 20th anniversary in 2020, and they threw us a pandemic. They really shouldn't have.
So I guess let's start at the beginning of the beginning. So how did you find yourself getting involved with RPGs? I mean, was this something you found out as a love in your kind of teenage years? Did you play in college? Basically, where does your story begin?
Well, like a lot of my friends in middle school and in high school, I was one of those super nerdy, heavily bookish, a little bit theatrical kids, and boy, was role playing just a siren call for us. I didn't end up playing a lot of Dungeons and Dragons, although I had heard plenty about it, because in those dark days, I was informed that it was a game for boys, and I probably wouldn't like it. So it took until high school, and I was living in Northfield, Minnesota, which has two liberal arts colleges, St. Olaf and Carleton. And a faction of young people from St. Olaf were designing their own role-playing game called Ars Magica, or some people would pronounce it Ars Magica. And they were looking for people to run games and play test and kind of be involved in getting it started up. And that's how I ended up getting in. At the height of it, I was playing like 3 games a week because I was a, high school student and didn't have anything else to do. It was perfect. And then, the game was well received, and the group of students kind of hung together and started making a serious effort at being publishers, even though we were all like 18 to 23 and didn't really know what we were doing. And that's how I kind of fell backwards into a career in gaming.
I mean, that's got to be kind of inspiring, because I spoke with another gentleman recently, Phil Bricado, who worked on Mage, and he started out with like White Wolf, and a lot of people who kind of got inspired by TSR. I believe he worked on Ars Magica as well for a time. And it's just kind of cool just to see how people turn that passion and love for something as a nerdy hobby into a creative career, because I myself don't know a lot of people who've been able to turn that super passion for gaming into something concrete, solid, to make an actual kind of living off of. As always was the pipe dream kind of growing up, as people who would sit around the lunch table, create these epic dungeon crawls or adventures, and to actually turn that into a printed product you could hold in your hand and buy in a retail store. So one of the things I would love to talk with you about is, I saw in your bio there, you worked at a gaming magazine for a little while, and that was huge in the like 90s and like 80s there too, because you'd get all sorts of new stats, you get short stories, fiction and whatnot, and just things that would expand the lore, like back in the era of like Dragon magazine, which was published until like the mid-90s too.
Yeah, that used to be the way that you could break into the industry. You would write an article for Dragon, or you would write an article for one of the other magazines that focused on, Pyramid Magazine would do all their GURPS stuff. You could write a GURPS article and get your name out there, that kind of thing. I actually got some experience working on magazines when I went to work at White Wolf. Because the company that we started to do our Magica was Lion Rampant. And then the Wick brothers were also college-age students who were self-publishing this magazine, White Wolf Magazine, and we were like mutual fans. They liked our Magica, we liked their magazine. And eventually that led to us merging the two companies together under the banner of White Wolf to release Vampire the Masquerade. Before Vampire came out, there was this crossover period where we're doing mostly Ars Magica supplements, and I was also working on doing the magazine, picking up the layout of the magazine and making sure it got to print. So I had a little bit of experience in working on magazines directly when I moved to Canada with my then husband, who was moving to start a master's program at UBC in Vancouver. And I got connected with a group of writers, of role-playing game writers and fiction writers who had kind of gathered around Nigel Findlay, who lived in the area and ran a really loose writers group out of like the bar near his house. So once a week we would all meet up at the bar and have drinks and talk about gaming. And we decided to launch a magazine that was Adventures Unlimited. We were bi-monthly, and it was just a compilation of adventures produced for different games that were out at the time. I just ran across the PDFs of those that had been pirated somewhere and put up online, because this predated PDFs.
Oh wow!
Back in the old days, we were doing layout with like a waxing machine and the whole bit. We were very, very old school. This PDF thing was technology that came into being years after the magazine had ceased production. So it was pretty cool, actually, for me to see that somebody had bothered to like scan it and put it all together and make it available for people. It wasn't just lost to history.
What are some of the really cool kind of memories that kind of came out of those early days? Do you remember any specific adventures, items, or fiction that really kind of stood out to you from that time?
Oh my goodness, so much actually. You can really see my influence. It's funny. I was talking to a friend recently who had kind of missed that era of gaming in the 90s, when there was a lot of small press, but the term like indie gaming hadn't really been coined yet. But there were people who were just doing all of these great, bizarre, fantastic, creative things that maybe weren't really necessarily going to be commercially viable, but were super fun and interesting. So, especially in the magazine, you could see like I personally did an adventure for Castle Falkenstein, and I wrote an adventure for Over the Edge, which was a surrealist game that Atlas Games had put out, and I had worked briefly for Atlas Games in between working for White Wolf and moving to Canada to start a magazine. So I was like, I'll just do these games that I know that, Everway, for example, another one, Everway, completely card-based mechanics, really visually appealing and interesting. Wizards of the Coast really tried to push it, and even with their backing, it just never really got the critical mass it needed to be successful in the day. But there I was trying to flog a magazine with adventures for it. So
I always was kind of sad that when I got into gaming in the mid 90s, I was very much a teenager and wasn't into a lot of the super heavy gaming. Although I did discover Vampire the Masquerade, I'm going to say probably around 96 is when I fell into it. Maybe a little bit beforehand, but I always thought it was such an creative world, and I would compare it to the modern Marvel Cinematic Universe. The fact that there were so many game lines working together, but it all started with Vampire the Masquerade, which then would expand out to Werewolf, the Apocalypse, Mage, the Ascension, Wraith the Oblivion. I'm trying to remember if I missed any. Hunter the Reckoning, Demon the Fallen, Changeling the Dreaming. So what was it like to work on early White Wolf to begin to form this huge universe that would have these ultra powerful bad guys, but also have this huge meta plot that would evolve? Because one of my last interviews I did talked about how it was all very haphazardly thrown together, but everything had to start somewhere. You had to start with I think it was the 13 clans, like the Bruja, the Toreador, the Tremere, the Ventru, et cetera, et cetera. What was it like just to see these things come to life and know that something greater was probably going to spin out of it?
It was pretty fun, really, because we took a lot of what we had done for Ars Magica. Ars Magica has a very similar structure of the wizards in hiding from a world that doesn't understand and that persecutes them for their magical abilities and knowledges, and the different clans in Vampire, kind of like the different schools of magic in Ars Magica. So it was. Yeah, we took a lot of what we had learned in creating that Ars Magica background, and really, you can really see where we fleshed it out and learned from what we had done and really, improved on it. I have to say that, over the years, when we were doing it, I had no idea. I don't think any of us had any idea that it would last as long as it has, and that it would become such a stable mythology that is like a touchstone in the industry. It's humbling to think about, because I mean, like I said, we were kids. I turned 21 the last year that I worked at at White Wolf.
Now, what were some of your main contributions to Vampire? Because I'd love to be able to say that's Nicole right there. What's something that you did directly?
Well, so this is where it gets really hard, because there were a lot of collaborative moments where we were all brainstorming something together, or we were playtesting something together. Something would come up in the middle of a game. Like, I believe I was the person who realized that there was something with the botch rules in the very early editions where I could stand over a prone, unconscious enemy with a gun, shoot, hit, point blank, fail to do any damage. Like, it's like, okay, this is a problem with the game. That is a scenario that should never happen, because that is no fun. But I can't, like, I was doing a lot of the background support in those days. We were all living in a house together, so it wasn't like we would get up and we'd go to the office. I mean, we just lived and breathed this stuff. We were sharing a couple of computers, so we had shifts. Like, Mark would be writing during the day, and then at 6 o'clock he would tag out, and then I would come in and I would start doing layout for 12 hours, and then he would tag back in, and so that we could maximize use of the one computer that we had. Scenarios like that. So I did a lot of collaborative work, but there's nothing that I feel like I can take and say,
Okay.
yes, all of the Tremere, because I had this wonderful idea.
Okay, then allow me to rephrase that question a little bit kind of differently then. So, looking back on those early days, maybe what's something that you're super proud of that came out of all those early collaborative sessions that has maybe stayed in the game so far? Because the game did have a 20th anniversary edition, and it was recently given away, or a version of it was recently given away for free during this pandemic, which is great and fantastic.
Yep.
The game is still being supported today. What's something that you're glad that has always kind of stayed in the game? Because one of the things I've really enjoyed about Vampire the Masquerade is how it is kind of a dark mirror to society. It's a satire, but it's also meant to be a reflection of retaining those last shreds of humanity. Is there any core value? Is there a character? Is there a clan? Is there anything that's really kind of stuck out to you as, I'm glad that's still around today?
Well, so this is not exactly what you're asking me, but I have to tell you, looping back to being in an industry that's mostly male dominated, we did not expect how much of the live action Vampire would take off. And we did not expect how many women would enthusiastically begin to make Vampire their place where they were going to really shine. Like, I literally saw the change in Gen Con and other conventions that we went to, where I was where I would be in my booth, and I would be the only woman, or maybe one of two women in the booth, and I would be assumed to be somebody's girlfriend. To well, I disabuse them of that pretty routinely, and it's all right. They learned. But to see, like, literally could trace, because all of a sudden there were all of these goth women, all of these amazing, powerful, confident goth women who were just like, oh, I've found my place and I'm taking it. This is mine now. It was amazing to see that, and really refreshing as a woman in the industry, used to working on things that maybe don't always get the attention that the creatives get. Like, there were always a lot of women who were working on things like editing or layout or in art. They were contributing, but their name wasn't on the cover as I made this. That was always somebody else. Vampire really changed that, and I think that it deserves a lot of credit for for helping to open up role playing to women and girls. I'm proud of that.
I would actually kind of go along with that because Vampire with me, I played some of the tabletop. I bought more books than I actually played, but I played a LARP in the mid 2000s, and some of the first people I played with were women, and they were given very prominent positions within the city, not just by their husbands and boyfriends, but because of their strength of their kind of role playing, which I thought was something really kind of neat, because in most of the gaming groups I've been a part of, frankly, we're a little bit behind the times, to put it lightly.
Sure.
But these people kind of grasped how they could be in this space. This was theirs. And live action role playing to me was something so new and so different. And I've been to a couple of Camarilla events in Toronto, and dare I say it, the women outnumber the men, which is, I think, tremendously cool.
Yep. And again, like LARP was a thing that we had tried without really knowing what we were doing, reinventing the wheel. I'm sure there were people out there with lots of actual live action role play structure, and I know that we got a few people who had experience with the SCA. I'm sure that affected how things developed. But we did some live action wizards tribunals again for Ars Magica, with the idea being that everybody is playing their venerated wizard at the same time, which was not part of the structure of how Ars Magica was designed. We'd have a wizards tribunal, and there would be politicking, and there would be all of this stuff. And I really saw again how that was iterated on and refined and really took off as the vampire LARP. But our experience in trying to do it as the Wizards Tribunal was the first time that I ever encountered live action role play in a structured, beyond just playing with my friends in the backyard as kids playing pretend. It was super cool.
I gotta say, I'm glad there's still a very live and very vibrant live action role play community, though not so much at the moment right now. That being said, I want to transition to kind of advance the timeline, so to speak. So to bring things up to the year 2000, and Green Ronin, you said, is celebrating its 20th anniversary. And I'm pretty sure I asked Chris this, but I want to hear your side of the story. What is the origin story, as you see it, of Green Ronin starting in 2000?
Well, Chris and I had both been working in the industry as freelancers or having done our own stuff. Chris had started a publishing company with his brother and his best friend called Ronin Publishing, and in that company, he had been known as the Green Ronin. Everybody in the company was supposed to pick a color, red, black, green, whatever, and then they would have these designations, but he was the only one who did. And that was the transition for him to be when we started the company to call it Green Ronin. I had been working for Cheap Ass Games at that point, and Chris was working at Wizard of the Coast at that point. And he was transitioning into doing miniatures for his day job, which has always been a passion of his. And Wizards was starting a metal miniatures division that he was going to be the creative director for. And he decided that he was really interested in still doing some projects in RPGs. The first project was a beer and pretzels game called Orc that we put together just as a fun little thing to do, to keep our hands in. And then the open game license happened, and we were sitting very well positioned to take advantage of the opportunity that it presented by putting out third edition Dungeons and Dragons compatible materials. That's kind of how we built our name, doing that work for several years.
one of those books that came out of it, I actually backed as a Kickstarter a couple of years ago. I'm officially canon in your universe. Is Freeport, which I thought was tremendously cool. So, do you have any stories from Freeport, the city of adventure?
Oh boy, Serpent Man, right? Like, uh, so one of the things that I really loved that we were able to do at the time was to get second use rights to those beautiful Brahm pieces that we used on the original trilogies. Instead of having somebody do brand new art for us, which would have taken our entire nest egg that we had set aside to do this. We found a creative way to get some good second use art out there, and wow, did that become an iconic kind of look for us? Those second use Brahm pieces really set the tone of what we ended up developing. Like, we really riffed off of what those covers represented, and that art made it into the book in character descriptions and stuff that we would not have necessarily put together if it had been the other way around. If we'd had somebody, I don't think we could have done a better job if we had had the character concepts and the factions and stuff in mind and had somebody draw them for us. I love that. I love the collaborative idea of being inspired by somebody's art or somebody else's character or something that somebody else has done. That's why I really loved that we were working on those wild cards. I mentioned one of the ways that we got to know George Martin and ended up working on the Game of Thrones material that we did is that he had been doing these shared world anthologies about superheroes called Wild Cards, and we started doing Wild Cards books for Mutants and Masterminds. There's a thing in Ars Magica. I don't know if you know how much it plays. I could go on about it's my very favorite game because I started with it and I know it inside and out very intimately, but it is not a game that is balanced on the tabletop level. Like, each character is balanced against another. It's not like Dungeons and Dragons where everybody is a 5th level something. It's balanced in a meta sense. And I found that a lot of people approach the game but want to take away some of that meta balance. Everybody has a wizard, but you don't play your wizard all the time. You have a secondary character. Sometimes I'm playing my wizard. My wizard is going off on an adventure for some particular reason, and your companions are coming along. One of the other things that it posits is that there is a pool of shared characters that from game to game, I might play, Dogue the Rogue, but you might play Dogue next time. And that through that shared experience of playing the same character through different people playing in different adventures and scenarios, but all building from the shared experience. I found that really rich, and I love working that way. I love that kind of collaboration and strive to do it whenever possible.
Yeah, I've never heard of a game taking that approach before, or at least in my role-play experience, I've never had a chance to do something like that because everybody becomes so fiercely protective of their character. And obviously you have your avatar, whatever it may be, but even if they take control of a secondary character, they become so possessive, like mine is the precious sort of thing. So that's kind of fascinating to hear that.
I am extremely fortunate that when I began seriously role playing, it was with a group that had these open concepts like that and that were playing with these ideas so early in my formative years of gaming. Later on, I found out that most people enter gaming at that point. Everybody entered gaming through Dungeons and Dragons, and then they spun off to a few different things. Like, they played Traveler, or they played GURPS, or they played Pendragon, or they played RuneQuest. They're just like these touchstone games that they moved from D&D too, but nobody ever started off in those places. Nobody said, well, Jaroon was my first game. And so there were a lot of assumptions at the table that come from learning and starting role playing with a shared experience of we all played, Keep on the Borderlands. Like everybody in those days had, oh yes, my Keep on the Borderlands story is this, and our group did this, and the idea that a party is structured in a particular way, and that particular concepts are just inherently baked into a game were not true for me, and so I've been really able to use that in my career, and have really enjoyed having that different perspective and being able to say, actually, if we sat down and we all shared this character for a while, you might have, this experience. It might reveal this to you, which seemed like a really straightforward thing, since I had learned it from the get-go, but it just blew people's minds. Like the idea that you would have a rotating game master, or that one game master would be telling the stories that dealt with, raiding the Dragon's Hoard, and he was the guy who did all the Dragon's Hoard type of adventures. But Lisa was the one who did all of the internal, like, in-town politicking and secret spy adventures.
One of the things that I would like to ask you about, because as Green Ronin has evolved and had the open game license, it's created several of its own games, but it's also taken on different licenses over the years. And you've mentioned you got a Song of Ice and Fire, Game of Thrones, but you've also had Dragon Age, you've had the Expanse, and you even licensed one from a fairly popular YouTube show known as Titan's Grave, The Ashes of Valkana. So I'd like to know, how does one even get a license to do something like that? Because obviously, you have a system, but how do you go up to these guys, I'm presuming in suits who don't know what the hell you're talking about, saying, I'd like to play pretend. Will you let me play X? How do I make money off this? Like, how does that process work?
Wow, there is no single answer to that. I have found that some licensors are super easy to deal with. Some don't know what they're doing at all. And there's a whole range in between. In the case of Dragon Age, the BioWare folks were great. Old time, the Dragon Age team specifically, old time tabletop game people. So they understood the concept going in and were interested in seeking out on their own someone who might be willing to pick up and do it, which is how we ended up working on that project, where in other cases, it's been a license that we were particularly interested in. For example, early in the D20 era, we did both Thieves World books and a Black Company book based on novels that were popular with our designers, who said, I've always thought this would be a great role-playing game setting, and I'm just going to find out how to approach Glenn Cook and see if he's interested in taking a little money and giving us permission. Whereas something like working on the DC license, DC Universe, that's a huge prospect. And for a long time, we were kind of trying to figure out how we could go about it as a small company with a very niche market compared to Superman Underoos or Batman lunchboxes or whatever. And what we did with DC is we pitched them on the idea of a limited license for 4 books that would be divided specifically: world book, character books, main rule book. 4 books, that's it. That's all they had to worry about approving. It was going to be very heavily outlined. book number 2 has exactly this in it. Book number 3 has exactly this in it. And we did not ask for exclusive rights. At any point, somebody else could have come in and said, yeah, we also want to do a DC game, and we want to pair it with our mega adventure system, which is different than the Mutants and Mastermind system. And they, in theory, could have done that. By picking and choosing what rights we were asking for and keeping it limited, we were able to get the license to work on DC stuff that we couldn't have afforded under a more traditional open-ended license, where we just say, for 5 years, we want to make as many books as we can about your property, and we'll have a guarantee of $100,000 or something, which we couldn't have come up with.
I gotta say, I was always such a huge fan of the DC role play game that you guys did, because the layout in those books is fantastic. The system was great. We actually on a podcast I ran years ago, we actually did a crossover with the Marvel universe. So we did some rule hacks. But it was so much fun just to have these characters represented, because I had a DC role-playing game from like the 80s, and I think it was just known as like the Batman role-playing game, and it was okay.
Yeah.
But it was just so much fun just to see a license treated well, and such a big license. And then obviously you got Game of Thrones was huge. And one license I was surprised that someone would pick up on, but I've heard nothing but critical acclaim for the show, is The Expanse. What would make you guys choose that one in particular?
Well, as far as our holdings and the things that we do, we have some modern games. We have superheroes. We have lots and lots of fantasy, but we didn't really have anything to reach people in terms of like near future and spacey kind of sci-fi. So in looking to broaden the appeal of our base system, the age system, which is what has powered all of our home games since we started doing Dragon Age, that made the Expanse very appealing. It's also another one of those opportunity licenses where we happened to know the authors.
Oh,
We met one half of James S.A. Corey in his previous day job as George Martin's assistant. So when we were working on the Game of Thrones, and George was very busy as he was on the verge of releasing one of the next novels, and the TV show was coming up, and so on. Ty was actually our point of contact on getting approvals done. So Ty had worked with us and knew our stuff was good. And so when he and Daniel were thinking about that they would like to see the Expanse in tabletop form again, we were approachable and a known quantity because they had experience with us. So that definitely, set the stage for us all to work together, and it's been fantastic. They're great guys who know gaming and started out as the whole Expanse thing started out as a game that turned into novels, that's turned into TV, that's now turned back into a game.
It's the whole circle of life, so to speak. Now, one of the other things I've always wanted to get the behind the scenes story is, a couple of years ago, there was a series of web shows, and it was called Titan's Grave, Ashes of Valkana, and it was game mastered by space nerd himself, Will Wheaton, who has been a previous guest on this show. People know him from The Big Bang Theory, Star Trek, etc. And I was always wondering, how did that all come together? Like, what's the behind the scenes story there?
Well, first, Will is obviously genuine nerd material, right? So, literally, I mean, there were olden days where he and some of our other game industry friends and we would be talking about our game stuff. He was a legit nerd for our True 20 game that we published. So we knew Will. We'd been in contact with him, and um, he was looking for some people to collaborate with on this show, where he thought he would take people through a role playing game, not like a live streaming watch 4 hours of it, but more of a introduction with like cutouts where you would explain die roll, and we would talk a little bit about here's how rules work, and then you'd watch people play for a little bit more, and there'd be an overarching story that they could follow, but it was also a teaching tool, and we thought that was absolutely fantastic. So we all collaborated on that, including the building of the world for the TV show, the writing of the episodes that ended up airing. Unfortunately, this all went through the Geek and Sundry company. So this wasn't an arrangement that we had directly with Will, but it was under the umbrella of Geek and Sundry. And Geek and Sundry has undergone many changes in the few years since that project aired. We had written, working with Will and his son Ryan, and several of our reliable freelancers, to put together a world book that we meant to release. It's actually been written. I believe it's been edited, and it's stopped short of being laid out because the situation at Geek and Sundry kind of fell apart. The people with whom Geek and Sundry were working for these shows, Will Wheaton, Felicia Day, even the Critical Role cast, have all spun off, left, broken up with Geek and Sundry, and so that puts the rights to the licenses in this weird limbo place where Will can't do what he wants with Titan's Grave. He can't authorize us to release the book that we did, even while we had the license, because he had a dispute separate from the things that we were working on. The same thing happened with our Critical Role book, actually. We worked on Critical Role, putting out a Dungeons and Dragons compatible source book for their first web series, but they have since spun off from Geek and Sundry and are their own entity now, and they have taken over the production of their own gaming material, which is fantastic for them. But it means that the license that we had with Geek and Sundry, not with Critical Role directly, had to be addressed, and we ended up coming to an agreement with them where we passed them the materials that we had worked on for Geek and Sundry. So that is all going to be under their banner now. And I don't know actually what their plans are for releasing the book and the material that we worked on originally, but I do know that it's all like in their house now, so it's not split where they've got this weird situation where they're doing all this current stuff, but their previous stuff is under the Geek and Sundry banner or under the Green Ronin banner. It's all theirs now. So everybody's all sorted out, but unfortunately, like, there's still some like, it's unfortunate that we'll probably never be able to release that Titan's Grave book. It's sitting there done, and it's so specific to the setting and the people who worked on it that it's not as if we could just pretend it wasn't Titan's Grave and call it Grave of Titans and just release it. It's becomes more tricky.
I remember specifically when it was announced, I think via your Facebook page or someone's Facebook page, and everybody was talking about it and really excited for it. I actually remember being very vocal on the Facebook page saying, man, I can't wait for this to come out. And then obviously, as you just described, things happened, lawyers, rights, disputes, whatever. That's really unfortunate. And I'm not gonna lie, I do hope for a Christmas miracle at some point.
Hey,
But
we've got it ready. If Will comes and says, "Hey, it's all resolved and I've got the rights 100% back in my pocket," we got that book. We'll bring it out.
my God, I certainly hope so. So I guess as we begin to kind of wind down this interview, what are some of the things that are in the pipeline? Because like I said, this is your 20th anniversary. I know when this interview airs, you'll have just had your 20th anniversary sale. And I know things with the global pandemic right now, it kind of throws a lot of things up in the air. But what are some of the things that are happening for you? What are some of the challenges and hopefully victories you guys should have in 2020?
Yeah, boy, this is not how we imagined it was going to go.
No.
Right? It's been really weird because everything is shut down for us. We had the warehouse that handles our fulfillment for our web store. It has been shut down for 2 months. So the only thing we're selling at the moment is PDFs. We have no fulfillment. We sent 2 books to print, including a Kickstarter that I have been working on. It's been so cursed for like 2.5 years. It's been cursed, and I'd finally sent it to print. I'm going to get this thing finally out. Our backers have been so patient, and we send it to the printer, and the printer's like, "Yeah, we're shut down indefinitely. We'll get on it as soon as Lithuania opens for business again." And I was just like, these are challenges. These are really interesting times. One thing that we are doing is we're pivoting to accommodate the fact that people are doing more online, and so we're stepping up some projects that we had in the works for working with tabletop role playing apps like Fantasy Grounds and Roll20. We are looking at trying some new cool projects that maybe we wouldn't have done if we had to slot them into a production schedule that was reliant on printing and distributing to bookstores and game stores, with that piece just missing and with it being unknown for however long. We're going to do things like we are releasing here's a little scoop for you. We are releasing a fully self-contained book, role-playing game of its own, based on the Chronicle system that powered our Game of Thrones game. We've dabbled in the past with a couple of like little generic supplements and things. Here's a mountain environment to play in, or here are some creatures that you can throw into your game. But we've got a guy who's really excited to do the work and see it as a fully realized surprise release. And so it's going to be a fully realized surprise release. Hey, guess what? New game for y'all. Here it is. Look what we got.
That is exciting news. When might we expect to see that?
It is like weeks away. It is very, very imminent. And we're working on a lot of stuff like that. Like I've found that we are freed up to do a lot more brainstorming and to just kind of throw caution to the wind. We're also talking about, because summer conventions are canceled, and that's where we would see a lot of people. We have had 20 years of going to Gen Con every year. I have not missed Gen Con since I started going, and my first was 1989. But we're not going to be gathering hundreds of thousands of people together under current circumstances. We'll be lucky if we can see conventions of 1,000 people, and so we're moving to do things like have an online presence, have a virtual Green Ronin Con, do more stuff. We've got some great fans in the official, unofficial Discord channel who have been absolutely wonderful about seeing our freebooters run games, do specials, do giveaways to really help us find ways to do the stuff that we would normally be out there in the communities doing face-to-face.
Well, I got to say, it's going to be a good year. I think just from how you guys are kind of positioning yourselves to get ready for 2020. I mean, yeah, it's arguably a dumpster fire 2020, but you guys are ready. You're prepared. You're smart about it. And I think, honestly, success is going to find its way to you no matter what.
As long as I can keep paying my people and keep my lights on. My needs are few, but those are two things that I want to keep doing, because we have such good people, and I just want them to be able to keep being the fantastic creators that they've been the last 15 and 20 years of working with us.
I don't think you're going to have a problem. So guys, if my listeners want to find more of your products and materials, where would they have to go?
greenronin.com.
All right, cool. So guys, if you want to find out more about Nicole, like she just said, go to greenronin.com. There are tons of fantastic games there. You can also find her stuff on drive-thru RPGs right now. I know a lot of brick and mortar stores are still closed, but obviously support the games that they make because they are fantastic. The Expanse is a really cool TV series you probably shouldn't be sleeping on. There's a game there. There's a Game of Thrones RPG. There's Mutants and Masterminds, which is fantastic and wonderfully supported. My personal thing, if you want a really cool Easter egg for This Week in Geek, if you happen to find a copy of the Freeport game, which you can also get digital as well as physical, if you look under their NPC selection, there's a character there named Thera Narleth. Thera Narleth is my Pathfinder character that I played for the better part of a summer in my friend Chris's game, and I paid the money for their Kickstarter when this originally came out. So if you want to play Birdman, I am an Elvis sorcerer water witch with my ship named after my cat, Dr. Wiley, which you can probably hear him screaming in the background right now. So anyway, Nicole, thank you so much for joining us here on This Week in Geek.
This is an absolute delight. Thank you for giving me the time.
All right, guys, that was my interview with Nicole. So once again, be sure to check her out. So guys, until next time, I'm going to quote my friend Jackie Bam Bam. And as he says, be cool, be kind, be careful. We'll catch you guys again next time right here on ThisWeekInGeek.net.
Well, that's our show. All right, here's the deal. Every time you watch my show, I will send you $40.
Checks will not be honored.
You've been listening to This Week in Geek, your source for guaranteed nonsense or your money back. Tune in next week for more info on the most important things you didn't need to know. Check out our website at ThisWeekInGeek.net and subscribe to our podcast through iTunes or any podcatcher. If you'd like to comment on this episode, head over to this episode's post at ThisWeekInGeek.net and leave a comment through Facebook Connect. Follow us on Twitter at ThisWeekInGeek.net and follow our Instagram at twig_official_podcast. Social media not your thing? Send us an email at feedback@thisweekingeek.net. We'll see you next time, and remember,
lower your shields and surrender your listenership.
Just when you think this show is terrible, something wonderful happens.
What?
It ends.
I have to go. Somewhere there is a crime happening.